ryegrass is much bigger than that. So, it's possible that some of our solutions to the changing climate lie in, other cultivars of ryegrass that we didn't sow in New Zealand. Not solely in that, because I still, the research is still very much in favour and all in agreement that more diverse is better than less diverse, and even better than ryegrass white clover. Whereas, when you look at through the literature, Conan, a lot of it compares to monocultures. And so you're talking just a grass grown somewhere in the world versus a grass and a legume, or two grasses and a legume, or a grass and two legumes. Maybe a herb thrown in. We're comparing against a base of ryegrass white clover as a standard across many farms in New Zealand. But even there, the more recent research coming out of Ireland in particular, where 3 to 4 things are out competing the ryegrass white clover. And those 3 to 4 things are mixtures of a couple of grasses, a couple of legumes, maybe a herb replacing one of the grasses or one of the legumes. And again, all the research says diversity holds until you've got a handful of things. And then the more things you throw in after that, they just tend to replace each other.
This podcast is brought to you by GroundShift. If you're anything like me, you've probably realised that doing things the way they've always been done doesn't always lead to better outcomes on the farm. And that's where GroundShift comes in. GroundShift is all about helping farmers rethink the way that they approach their soils, the inputs into their system, and improving their overall farm system performance. We focus on building resilience, improving efficiency, and ultimately creating more profitable farm systems. It's not always about throwing more into your system. Sometimes it's about understanding what's driving those results beneath the surface. So if you're serious about improving your farm's profitability and resilience, and utilising biology to drive your farm system performance, I highly recommend checking out groundshift.ag, and you can follow them online at groundshift.ag on Instagram. Welcome to another episode of the From the Soil Up podcast. Today's special guest is 2 very prominent researchers from Massey University. I've got Donaghy and Eru Tait-Jamieson here with me today to talk about pasture diversity. How are you guys today?
Yeah, good, thanks, Conan. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Eru, how are you?
It's raining outside my window at long last.
Yeah, the drought's broken in the Manawatu.
Yeah, me and Eru were talking before this. We've had like the opposite summers here. Canterbury's been wet and you guys have been dry.
Yeah, you can have yours back next year, I think.
Yeah, I think we'd like some sunshine. We haven't had much of a summer. So first of all, what's the biggest mistake farmers make when they're trying to establish diverse pastures?
For me, I think it's not in identifying the constraints, one of which can be their own management, and just thinking diversity is going to solve things for them. A lot of people look at pasture species in general as a silver bullet, Conan. We've seen that all through my career, where there's a new cultivar coming out or a new species, or what if we just throw them all in together and surely that'll fix things. Maybe another one is looking at diversity as a number. So the more I've got, I should be better, right? Edu, what do you?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's really about doing the homework of what's going to grow well and what are you prepared to move your management for. Because if it's not ryegrass, you can't just treat it like ryegrass and expect it to grow like ryegrass. So I think you can spend time ahead of planting rather than money at planting, I think.
Yeah, no, you do see people spend a lot of money on diversity, and whether that is exactly what they need for their situation is quite important. So how much does region, soil type, or farming system influence that selection of the species?
Yeah, it's pretty big, Conan. So, one of the other things I think that people need to be clear on is trade-offs, because often, they want everything, and just being clear what they actually do want, and then that might set the selection of species that they're after. So one of the things that we often see in nature is a trade-off between production and persistence. As a plant or even an animal, including us, you're here for a good time or you're here for a long time, and there's a natural trade-off between greater productivity and persistence, and yet often people want both, and so you'll choose the more persistent species and then complain they're not as productive, or you'll choose the productive ones and then say, they only lasted a year and a half. Whereas understanding a little bit more around those trade-offs is quite important, and some of those trade-offs could be your topography. If I've got hill country or I've got wet, low-lying paddocks, then there's a bunch of species won't suit that, no matter how many times I shove them in there.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So how would someone understand where that starting point is and then the selection is? I guess that's probably the hard thing, is to understand what they're trying to achieve with that pasture.
Yeah, I reckon so, and sort of we've come up with an approach which is not novel because other people have done a similar thing, but just trying to codify this to make it easier for farmers. So you sort of start with the farmer right at the centre, rather than someone who's trying to sell a seed mix or a pasture type, and the farmer being really clear around defining their objectives and identifying their constraints. And some of those constraints can be with their own management, which is always a tough conversation to have, because, human nature says that, yeah, I can be pretty hard on myself, but if you're asking me to be honest, I'm probably going to be less honest than more honest around my own failings. And so we see that a lot, where people go, look, we'll just get a bag of 10 things or 20 things or 30 things and whack them in. And if you did a little bit more, like Eddie said, spend a little bit more time at the start, settling down to say, okay, where do I want to put these? What do I want? How am I going to manage them? Am I prepared to change my management? You might actually thin that list down a little bit. How you do that? I guess there's lots of resources that are out there. We come up with a booklet that sort of tries to capture, or has captured, all the research in this area, and then ideally there'd be an online version of that farmers could, and their consultants and others could tap into in the future. But where we're at the moment is basically this booklet that says, here's all the commercially available species in the country, here's their pros and cons, and here's what they might suit.
That's awesome. And is that available through the Massey University website?
Yes, we released a plan of it at National Field Days last year, and we got a fair bit of feedback from farmers and consultants on it, and we're just working our way through the changes to that at the moment. And it's funded by MPI, Ministry for Primary Industries. So they've sort of commissioned that with our input. And so that's what where we're at the moment. But I mean, a lot of that's available when you look at resources that are available on the web. There's publications that Journal of or New Zealand Grasslands have got that explain, particularly for hill country, where some of these species fit. Seed companies, they're fairly honest about the pros and cons. They'll explain, when you have a look on their websites, that these ones aren't suited to wet soils, or these ones don't have a good summer growth, etc. So information's already out there. It's just all over the place. And so we're aiming to bring that all together where farmers and consultants can just access it at once.
I think that, one of the key things there is probably the local context being more important than the regional. So New Zealand's a temperate country, and barring a few exceptions, almost the whole country is warm enough and wet enough to grow most of the pasture species we have available, with Northland being an exception for ryegrass, Central Otago being a bit different. So it's really going to come down to what's the best option for that topography and that farm. And that best option may be a plant that is a bit outside of its comfort zone still, because there isn't a better option there. So it's really coming down to what type of land is it going onto and how is it going to be used, because you really need that functional fit between the plant and the use of that plant.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That functional fit is a really good point there. How is it going to fit into my system, and what function do I need it for? Before we dive a bit deeper, I'll get you both to introduce yourself and share a bit more about your background. Eru, let's start with you.
I have a bit of a convoluted background. So I've born and raised on a certified organic dairy and sheep and beef farm. Spent pretty much my entire life living there, apart from a little furlough while I was at university. Undergraduate background was in chemical engineering, which was a bit of a ride, and by the end of that I knew for sure I didn't want to be a chemical engineer. So I went farming. Spent most of my 20s farming and having kids, starting a family, and then 2022, I think, I saw a job come up at Massey as a research technician and thought, that could be a fun way of changing course, and here I am. So I've been working in the Whenua Homeowner program here at Massey University since it started back in 22, and now also studying a PhD part-time, looking at native grasses and where or if they might fit into our pastoral landscapes.
Awesome. That's very interesting. And Danny?
Less interesting than Eru. I'm originally from Melbourne, from the suburbs of Melbourne. My grandparents had been farmers, and I just sort of fell in love with farming and what farmers do. And so I studied agricultural science in Melbourne, then went and did a PhD in northern New South Wales in the subtropics, then came down to Tasmania, and after a little bit of time quarantining there, came over to New Zealand.
That's very similar to here. It's it's a good quarantine spot.
That's
a lot of people from New Zealand go there and don't come home.
Absolutely. A lot of our dairy farmers over there are Kiwis, actually, and there's a really strong link with Fonterra as well.
So one thing that always comes up when we're talking about pasture and diversity is, what does that actually mean? Are we talking 30 species like going crazy, or is there like a minimal amount that we get the functionality within a sward?
I think it comes down to a couple of things, Conan. One is, what are the objectives of the farmer? So if the farmer wants high production and doesn't mind a bit of seasonality, then diversity might be ryegrass and white clover, maybe with another legume like red clover or another grass like cocksfoot or fescue in there, and then you fill the gaps with nitrogen fertilizer or supplement. If a farmer's objective is to reduce fertilizer inputs, particularly nitrogen, then that might set you on a course around diversity that's more legume heavy. And how do you obtain that? If you're trying to fill in a summer feed gap, or you're dealing with soils that periodically get waterlogged, then that might take you down a different track. The science says that no matter what you put in and how you put it in, the pastures will become more grass dominant over time. That's why internationally we've got grasslands, not legume lands or herb lands or something like this. So grass dominance is a given over time. Grass are the most aggressive of the types that we've got in there, like legumes, herbs, other species. And all of the research again says that no matter how many things you start with, you end up a year and a half in with a handful of things or less doing the heavy lifting. And that's true of forest communities, that's true of native grasslands, native scrublands. Whether that's by head count in terms of the amount of things you've got, or the biomass they produce, or the function that they do, it's about a handful of things or less that really dominate.
That's pretty fascinating. Why do you think no matter the situation, that it always comes back to just a handful of species that continue to dominate?
Probably because there's only so many niches that can be filled. In a pasture, whether that's sort of vertical space, the things that can grow tall and shade things around them, whether it's sideways growth, things that can fill gaps and keep moving sideways. So, things like kikuyu and white clover, some of our grasses are the taller standing ones, or whether it's a deep rooting activity or the ability to produce nitrogen like legumes. So, from an animal production point of view, the benefits of number of species are achieved somewhere between 3 to 5 things. And that's mostly because from an animal production point of view, you're talking legumes, you're talking herbs, and all the legumes occupy pretty similar niches. All the herbs occupy pretty similar niches. So the more you throw in there, what they're doing is they're just displacing other ones of the same type or of the same function rather than the same type. And then from a production point of view, it's somewhere between 4 and 8 different things. And then again, that's normally grass driven, and sometimes herb driven. And then again, the more you throw in there, they just replace each other. Eru,
I think Dave Chapman actually puts it really nicely with this sort of one-liner that every plant in your sward needs its day in the sun. So that diversity can vary over time when we talk about niches. A winter-active herb versus a summer-active. So there's can be a bit more space than is obviously on the face of it. But I think that not overcrowding those spaces within the pasture is the key to that diversity, because we talk a lot about the species richness of how many species we have within a pasture, whether that's 20, 30, 40, wherever that is. But maybe we don't talk so much about the evenness of those species. And I think that evenness is probably a lot of what people are wanting out of a diverse pasture. Because, you could have 90% ryegrass and 1% 10 other things. Is that more diverse than something that's 20% each of 5 things? And I think intuitively most of us are after that 5 things in reasonably even proportions. So I think probably the evenness of the species and how we achieve that, and which species as well. We could plant various forms of ryegrass and we're probably not achieving much difference in outcome compared to planting species that achieve a specific goal or fill a particular niche, as Danny said.
I like that term, the evenness through the pasture, because even if you go across a paddock on a dairy farm or a sheep and beef, you see that there's just, you'll never get a consistent paddock that's all the same, and there's different areas where it does really well. How are you finding it with the whenua Himanu? Is there any insights into how you can try and keep that evenness within a pasture sward?
No, I don't think we've cracked it. We see mixed results, right? And in some aspects, the longer grazing rounds and the longer residuals can help, but particularly in terms of herbs, chicory being the main one that quite likes growing quite tall. it seems to persist better under that regime. But on the other hand, legumes, which are a key thing we'd want out of some of those lower input systems, really hate shade. And so actually a more conventional looking round, perhaps with a higher residual to protect the base of red clover, for instance, and a little bit longer through summer, they're still wanting something that's quick turnover of grazing and getting light back into the sward for them before they get shaded out again by the grasses, rather than spending maybe 30 or 40 days in shade each round.
Yeah, I think that kind of comes back to that piece around the grazing management, doesn't it? That's really important for allowing your plants to thrive, and what are you managing for is the key part there.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Conan, because you're right. It changes across the paddock and from paddock to paddock. And it also changes season to season, doesn't it? So you see different things come in and out. And that's why it's important to have or to be thinking about an adaptive grazing strategy. Whereas if you just have a one-size-fits-all, I'm always going to be coming in on this round, or I'm always going to be grazing down to that residual or whatever, that might be a completely different situation 3 months' time or even 1 month's time. Species-wise to where you are now, and you could actually be, pushing them out of the pasture by not managing to what you've got in front of you. And a classic to that is, we've had a long history of trialling things other than ryegrass in research trials. And when you pick that apart, you find a lot of those studies have put in, there's put in prairie grass or fescue or cocksfoot or whatever it is. But then they've managed it the way they only know how, which is ryegrass white clover. So not surprisingly, you end up with a ryegrass white clover dominating after a period of time. And then the inevitable conclusion is, ryegrass is king. There's nothing that gets rid of it. Well, hang on, you didn't give those other things a chance to actually, if they were slower establishing, or if they needed a faster or a slower rotation at different times of the year, or a shorter or longer residual at different times of the year, they weren't given that. And so inevitably you end up with what you were managing for in the first place, which was ryegrass white clover.
Yeah, I've consistently seen that where people have invested in diversity and, spent a lot of money on a lot of diversity, and then they've just set it up with their ryegrass and white clover at the end because they weren't supported in how to change their grazing management and how it can make everything flourish. And then it's a big investment.
Yeah, and it is a pretty fine window to hit, because maybe one of our greatest achievements then is the cocksfoot dominance we've managed to achieve on some of our farmlands. We're certainly, where we haven't managed for ryegrass, cocksfoot has taken up that slack, which can have its own challenges, right? Because again, you're not wanting to create feed gaps by trying to fill a feed hole somewhere else in the season.
And I think, that's a lot of people who have achieved that with cocksfoot, or are fearful of creating that environment for cocksfoot to dominate over everything else, and then they've got to try and manage that. So it is, like you say before, Danny, it's about being adaptive, and I guess understanding where or what you're trying to achieve, isn't it, with your grazing? Yeah,
absolutely, and just being willing to. Farmers are great at being willing to trial and test different things. They're always looking to do something different and something differently, which is really cool. And you can do that within part of a paddock. You can do it within one paddock. Pairing paddocks up and doing something different in one, and then you do get the interplay of the species you put in and your own location in terms of soil type, topography, rainfall, temperature, those sorts of things. You get a little bit of that. And that's the typical thing that you get when you get discussion groups together, and there's always be someone down the road who's doing something that everyone else is trying and can't achieve the same thing. Or maybe they've got the one soil type in the district that's allowing those things to hang in, or maybe they're the one with the most focus on grazing management or some other management, fertilizer management or stock management or something in terms of their stocking intensity that other people aren't able to emulate. And that's, I think, one of the other mistakes that we do make is, often a take-home for farmers from discussion groups or field days is, the guy that we looked at has got a flash irrigation system, and if only I put a flash irrigation system in, I'd have the same results. They had a brilliant brassica crop, I might put the same, what cultivar they have, when did they sow it, etc. And maybe it was something as simple as pest management in the early stages of that brassica, or fertility management or seedbed management that really got it to get away. There was nothing magical in it. And often we look for something magical that might not be there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it can also be just a really good season as well, and you just happen to go look at it then. So there's so many factors that come into it, and just understanding like your context and trialling it in your context. And without doing that, you might stumble across something that works really well for you, but then for the neighbour it doesn't, because their soil type could be different, or grazing management, like you say. So that's something I always reiterate to people, was like, your context, you got to try it in your context. It doesn't, just because it works for someone else doesn't mean it's going to be your silver bullet. And, some people just find that quite hard to deal with until they actually have those realizations, or something works for them that didn't work for someone else. And they're like, oh, I get it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So if we're looking at just New Zealand in general and our pastures, how's the diversity from your point of view across the board? Because some people would say that there's not the diversity, or we don't manage it well enough to keep that diversity in. Is that your experience?
I've walked lots of paddocks for lots of years now on different farms across the country, and there are very few farms that have got monocultures. So, we've got diversity there in terms of numbers. What we're probably lacking is legume content in a lot of our pastures, and you hear that anecdotally from farmers a lot, that they'd like to see more, clover of some sort or legume of some sort in the pasture. And some of that comes down to nitrogen use, some of that comes down to grazing management and shading, some of that comes down to seed placement. There's some really basic research done a long time ago that says seeds don't like to be put in the ground more than about 4 times their diameter, simply because of the reserves that they've got to be able to allow them to get their leaves up to sunlight. And you look at what goes on with a lot of contractors, and a whole chunk of that smaller seed is getting buried. I'm off on a tangent now. The answer to your question is, I think we've got diversity, but then that feeds back differently into how farmers look at it. Like a lot of our dryland pastures here in the Manawatu and elsewhere will have cocksfoot in them over summer. And farmers have had experience with the older types of cocksfoot being quite stemmy, high stem to leaf ratio, animals not finding it as palatable. So they'll see that as a problem. Similarly, kikuyu and other summer grasses coming in, more and more into our pastures as the climate's warm, and people trying to get rid of that. And so often on farm, you walk across paddocks that are quite diverse, and the farmer will be talking about, I don't want that diversity in there because it's not serving the functions that I want. Yes, it's growing well, or it grows well during the summer, but I can't milk off it, or I can't grow the lambs on it, or the animals won't eat it, etc. So that comes right back to saying, if we can think of diversity as the functions that we're trying to get into our pasture, so, more evenness of production, or better ground cover at certain times of year, or better quality at certain times of year, greater legume content, etc., then you can plan and manage for that, rather than just ending up with something that you're continually fighting against. That's my take.
Yeah,
on
I think.
Sorry.
I mean, there is plenty of diversity in our pastures, but potentially a lot of what's there is not what's wanted. And I think that's the key. It's not the diversity farmers are wanting to see in their pasture. As much as I love it, they probably don't want to see quite so much yarrow. But
Eru's favourite plant.
Yeah.
He's been spreading it on our farms.
It's probably quite good before it gets real stemmy. It's probably good fibre in there.
It's the most persistent forage herb you'll ever encounter.
Yeah. That's good to know. I think that's why do you think people, is it because they don't understand the role that those plants are playing functionally for them, that they don't want them there? Or is it just because they can't believe that they can't perform on it?
Yeah, probably a bit of both, Conan. I mean, past experience is a real thing, isn't it, with people who have had something that the animals didn't milk well on, or they didn't do well on, in inverted commas, or a pasture that looked good but didn't perform. And again, it might have been a seasonal thing. It might have been just that paddock or something. But that sticks in your mind as in, I don't want that species, or I don't like that. If flip that around a bit. If you're seeing lots of broadleaf species coming into your pasture, so things like thistles and ragwort that animals don't eat or might be toxic to animals, that indicates there's a niche for things that have got broad leaves, like chicory, like plantain, even like yarrow, Eru. And so you might flip that around and say, well, gee, is there a place in this pasture for more herbs? Because they're coming in naturally. They're just not the herbs that I want. So I'd sort of think my way iteratively through it like that. But, the point we're making is that I think we've got lots of diversity in the pasture naturally because of the seeds that have been used over, the last 140 or so years in various parts of the country. And there's a fair bit of those still in the seed bank. And so things will just keep popping up whenever there's a gap caused by, dry summer or flooding or pugging or whatever it is. And I think there are some farmers who look at that and say, I'm trying to get ryegrass white clover and I end up with brome and cocksfoot. Should I start with brome and cocksfoot as my grasses and then look at what legumes can complement that rather than, ryegrass white clover only lasted 3 years, it's time to spray it out and start it again.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it because it's that expectation as well. Because, you've done all this work, you've done the tillage, you've paid for the seed, you've drilled it, you've looked after that new grass. I think to then walk into that paddock and see a bunch of things that weren't your expectation, that begins to feel a bit like, oh, this isn't what I set out to achieve. And that can close the door a bit to thinking about what is there and what that's telling you. And certainly, it gets you into sort of that deficit mindset of, oh, well, I planted a field of the latest cultivars of ryegrass here and that's not what I'm seeing. First thought is, what did I do wrong?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we see quite a lot of things online about the benefits of diverse pastures. What are some of the most compelling, outcomes that you've seen in the research that you've been working with for trying to maintain the diversity in the pasture?
It'd be, I think at a higher level, it's evenness of production and greater resilience to stress, whether that stress is a drought or hot summer or a flooding event. More diverse pastures stand up in terms of being able to come back from those or hold density through those events rather than less diverse pastures. That would be one. And then, of course, you've got, if you can maintain a decent legume content in there, you've got free nitrogen and also an increase in quality because legumes have got lower fibre and higher protein naturally than grasses have. And so animals selectively graze those. Yeah, they'd be the biggest ones for me.
Anything to add, Eru?
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think it really is that yield stability between season and between years as well. Like this year being case in point, Cyclone Gabrielle being another. I think for our program running, we've had 4 completely different growing seasons. And so the evenness of performance across the diverse pastures, I think there's some real potential there when you're thinking about farm risk.
And I think, Conan, there's other, maybe less tangible benefits, but they're still really important. The amount of farmers who have said to me that, they're trialling different species in their pasture, and it's given them an interest in going back out into the pasture again. And these are generally older people who, may be coming toward the end of their career, and now they've got this new lease of life because they've seen all these different things flowering. They've got more insect life. And they might have more bird life as a result of that. And so there's a whole bunch of, ecosystem services in inverted commas that are, no one's paying you for them at the moment, but they're just as important if you think of getting your mojo back for some of these guys who might be getting a bit beaten down with seasons and, low or fluctuating prices and policies and all these things that are coming through. And then to get a new lease on life because I've got something new in the pasture is, I think, really cool.
Yeah, and I think most people do enjoy looking at diverse pastures, and and crimson clover's a great one because you've just come through calving, morale's at rock bottom, probably haven't slept in 6 weeks, and then you're just confronted with shocking beauty in your pasture. There's something in that.
Yeah,
I tend to agree. It's a little bit grounding, isn't it? It brings you back to why you do what you do as a farmer.
And that's really important as farming, is
finding
that why again after you've been through a hard patch. And I think walking out into a paddock and expecting to see just burned off ryegrass and seeing a bunch of things growing, that makes a difference to the way you approach your farm.
It builds that confidence and and the resilience in your system that you've created, which is a very important thing. As you say, you've had 4 different seasons the last few years in the research, and we're seeing a bit more of that across the board. So if you can build that confidence through those seasons, it can make a lot easier to make decisions.
Yeah, and we were talking
forward.
Sort of before we started about, a lot of old farmers saying 1 good year in 10. What if you can have 2? What if you can have 3? What if your best year isn't as great, but every year's pretty good? And I think it's that sort of conversation.
Yeah, that's a great conversation to be having, and it's like maybe you're not chasing that maximum every year, but if you can have a good or an increasing plane over time. And turn that from 1 good year to 5 or 6. That's a huge turnaround, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked a bit about the pasture species. Is there a measurable benefit? Say we've talked about the main 3 families, which are legumes, grasses, and herbs. Do you need all 3 of them to kind of get the benefits in the system, or is 2 good enough, or do things really start to unlock when you have all 3?
Pragmatically, I think all 3 would be cool. Pragmatically, if you were to put together a pasture mixture comprising 1 to 2 things from grass, legume and herb, you'd have a pretty good start. And for a lot of farmers who are wondering where to start, we've been to national field days and a bunch of regional field days the last few years as part of the Whenua Manu program, and we get a lot of farmers coming up saying, look, I don't want that hippie shit, I don't want the bloody salad. And then you go, well, what do you want? And they say, I just want to see a bit more legume in my pasture because, I've got ryegrass and white clover, that'll do me, but I'd like a bit more legume. And you say, what about red clover? What about lucerne? What about, grazing lucerne? What about subterranean clover? Horses for courses, right? What are they trying to deal with? When aren't they seeing the white clover? And they go, oh, yeah, that sounds all right. And then they say, oh, what about plantain? How do you get that in there? Because I've heard, amazing things about plantain, its ability to reduce nitrogen losses. And then you start talking about plantain, and then they start saying, well, ryegrass is sort of a bit hit and miss in some of the seasons. We get great spring growth, great winter growth, great spring growth, but then depending on the summer, it might clap out. So then you say, what about some of the newer cocksfoots or something like this? Oh, yeah. And within sort of 3 or 4 minutes, you're like, hang on, we started with, I don't want to move away from ryegrass, white clover. Now we're talking, you've just accepted 4, maybe 5 things that you could, 2 or 3 things you can add to your ryegrass clover base. And that would be quite a pragmatic way to start, because ryegrass, for all the way we've been talking about it in a negative light, is an incredibly adaptable grass. We're only dealing with a small part of its genetic ability as well, because you look at where it naturally comes from, North Africa and into the Middle East and then into Europe. We're only dealing with the stuff that suits a cool, temperate environment. Ryegrass is much bigger than that. So, it's possible that some of our solutions to the changing climate lie in, other cultivars of ryegrass that we didn't sow in New Zealand. Not solely in that, because I still, the research is still very much in favour and all in agreement that more diverse is better than less diverse, and even better than ryegrass, white clover. Whereas, when you look through the literature, Conan, a lot of it compares to monocultures. And so you're talking just a grass grown somewhere in the world versus a grass and a legume, or 2 grasses and a legume, or a grass and 2 legumes, maybe a herb thrown in. We're comparing against a base of ryegrass, white clover as a standard across many farms in New Zealand. But even there, the more recent research coming out of Ireland in particular, where 3 to 4 things are out competing the ryegrass, white clover. And those 3 to 4 things are mixtures of a couple of grasses, a couple of legumes, maybe a herb replacing one of the grasses or one of the legumes. And again, all the research says diversity holds until you've got a handful of things. And then the more things you throw in after that, they just tend to replace each other. So, 14 things isn't better than 4. 28 things isn't better than 4,
I like to think of it as like a diminishing returns, that there's going to be a certain point where you're just not going to get the benefits while you're chucking more money at it, trying to get that more diversity in the system.
I think, to go back to your sort of earlier question, I think having the herbs in there is an important part of that picture. So one of the trends we've seen across our diverse pastures is we're seeing competition, we think, between chicory and plantain and docks. So where we have those species planted, particularly where we're letting them grow tall, flower and drop seed, we're seeing that gap-filling niche in our pasture, because we get some gaps through winter. We're seeing that niche being filled by a pasture plant that we're after and that the cows are happily going to eat and do well on, instead of dock, which is easy to see is a bit of a problem.
Yeah, people love to focus on dock. As soon as they sit in the paddock, it becomes less of focus.
Well, it really stands out
there. yeah. Especially when it's a bit stalky.
It's good to sort of go back to what are the trade-offs, because none of our herbs, apart from Edu's favourite yarrow, are particularly persistent. They're gap fillers, and as soon as a competition comes on, they get crowded out and they bugger off, and then they'll pop up somewhere else if we've got the seed there. What we don't have is 140 years in this country of growing chicory and plantain, so there's not a lot in the seed bank. What there is in the seed bank is a lot of dock and thistle and ryegrass and old ryegrass, old cocksfoot, old clover, whatever else is around. So that's what tends to fill those gaps. The solution to that at the moment is either to let those species seed, so things like deferred grazing. Even then, they'll only fill in gaps. so they won't compete strongly in areas where you've already got density. They'll fill a gap if there's a gap nearby. Or you fill that gap by putting on a kilo or two of seed every year or second year with your capital fertiliser, or with lime, or with whatever else you might want to apply to the pasture. And that's a relatively cheap way of maintaining the herbs that you want in the pasture at a decent amount.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've seen some very good success with that. When we talk about diversity, and often when people say, particularly in the regen space, around when you have diversity above ground, you get the diversity below ground because you've got the different root structures, and that flows into soil biology. Has your research looked into that much with what's happening here in New Zealand?
Yeah, it has, and we broadly agree with that. I think we've got to look at the functionality that we've got below the ground, and the sort of cause and effect mechanisms. And as an example, what we're finding in our regen treatment, which is longer rotations, longer residuals, and far fewer inputs, is we're getting a more fungally dominant microbiome in the soil. I want to explore that a little bit more, because how much of that is due to our treatment? For example, if I'm leaving more dead material behind, that's normally broken down by fungus. Is that what's driving some of that fungal increase in the soil? Is just because we're leaving more behind? So it's a function of what we're doing. It's not necessarily vesicular arbuscle mycorrhizae fungi, some of which can specifically partner with plant roots to extend their breadth and depth and water uptake and nutrient uptake. So we need to look at that. I think Eru and I have had a chat recently about this, because the more productive your above ground system is, the more productive your below ground system is. So it's possible with a ryegrass monoculture at a high stocking rate and high fertilizer input to have massive amounts of microbes below the ground. Not all the same microbes either. It still have diversity, which is really cool, but we're not advocating that, of course, because there's downsides to that system. Yeah, that's some of our thoughts, Eru.
Not really much more to say on that, other than that we do see a lot of those changes that I talked about, and hopefully that'll flow through into our soil carbon story as well. Because certainly we have some roots going deeper, and some different roots will have different deposition of rhizospheric carbon and also dead carbon from breakdown of plant material.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question, was around the soil carbon and what sort of benefits you're seeing there. So is the rhizospheric carbon, that is what people would call the liquid carbon pathway? So
the root exudates. So it's rhizodeposition, I think, is the term there. So that's one of the mechanisms by which we're getting carbon going downward.
I guess you're seeing between your two treatments. Is there a difference yet, or is it obviously because it's a longer term process?
That's going to be the full 7 years before we really have much we can say about certainly non-labile carbon. So, I mean, even if we're getting more labile carbon in there in the short term, more microbial biomass, that doesn't mean we're not just increasing carbon cycling through that system. So it'll take longer to really nail on whether that's stable carbon going into the soil. And I guess, and that's on a backdrop of very high soil carbon. So across all of our farmlets, in common with a lot of probably New Zealand pastoral land, there is quite high soil carbon stocks. And so we're also sampling a bit deeper than is standard to see if some of those deeper rooted plants can drive some of that carbon further down.
And that's a really important point, Conan, because if you look at our pastoral soils compared to other areas of the world, we've got really high carbon levels generally. And there is a thing around carbon saturation, because everything has to equal 100%. So, pushing more carbon into that top layer of soil is possibly only going to increase carbon cycling. So the microbes will break that down. It'll go off as carbon dioxide. I think where the exciting bit is if we can establish and maintain pasture with a deeper root system than what we're currently used to, then we should be able to lock up carbon at greater depths. Again, that'll be a little bit soil type dependent, because on some soils that get very wet over the winter and the water table moves up, as those soils become anaerobic, that carbon can be lost back to the atmosphere, just natural processes. So, it's mainly bacterially driven, as I understand it. But I think, one of the real cool things for us is to be able to maintain more roots with depth, and to be able to tell that story internationally about how our farmers are carbon farming as well as meat and wool and milk farming.
Yeah, it's a great story. And probably helps with a lot of our selling our products into other countries as well, is like how we're actually building more carbon and drawing it down from the atmosphere or storing it in
Yeah, and I think
deeper.
it's really important to dig into that, because it's not a good enough story to say, look, we've already got high soil carbon. We need to be striving beyond that.
Yeah. For those that are listening around the world, kind of what is the average for a pasture based in New Zealand?
I'm not good at remembering specific numbers.
We're in that. All I can remember, Conan, is we're in that top quartile in terms of the top 25%. Sorry, in general of soil types around the world, and partly that's because our soils are relatively young. Compared to other more weathered soils in different parts of the world. And then, of course, we've had a long history of mostly forest cover, and then we've replaced that with pastoral farming that's evolved into, quite a high output per unit of land, and so quite productive pastoral base that in a climate that allows those pastures to persist. Again, internationally, longer than the plants do in many other parts of the world. So our rates of pasture renovation, pasture renewal in this country are on the lower end compared to other pastoral regions of the world.
That's quite very, very interesting. And I look at some of my friends farming in Australia and how much carbon and organic matter they're dealing with compared to what we have, and it's like, it's just a completely different story what they're trying to achieve compared to what we have as a starting point in our climate as well.
And so when you look at some of those areas that are, the sort of dust bowl states of the US and regions of Australia where they've double cropped, even triple cropped for a couple of generations now, and they've lost in some of those areas over a metre of topsoil, mostly through wind erosion, you're starting again, aren't you, from a sort of a bedrock of quite low fertility, low carbon soil. We've got issues in our country as well, don't worry, as you'd be well aware, around erosion and particularly water erosion and compaction of soils and degradation in other ways. But, we're starting at a much higher base. And it's soil dependent. I was listening to a researcher from Western Australia, and I can't remember her name, Lynn Abbott, I think it was. She's amazing. She's done a lot of research around soil biology at a time when soil biology wasn't a thing. Everyone was focused on soil chemistry and soil physics, and soil biology was like the forgotten cousin. And one of the takeaways I got from her was, lighter soils, so sandier type soils, we should be minimising the amount of activity we do on those soils in terms of, working the soil up, breaking up and interfering with the soil. Whereas heavier soils, some more clay type soils, actually benefit from being, routinely cultivated and worked because they naturally compact over time. And then we add on top of that animals and machinery, and that just speeds that whole process up. And so, this is from a soil biology, bacteria, fungi, and little micro and macroarthropods point of view. They benefit from some sort of, cultivation or disturbance in a heavy soil more often than they do on a lighter soil. So again, this sort of blanket idea of, we shouldn't be cultivating soils ever, because that's not good, is actually not right either. It's very soil type dependent.
And I'm also of the opinion that it's better to give something a bit of a tickle to set it up going further better in the foot, because sometimes that's a lot better than it only half establishing and then you're kind of having to go and redo it again, and you're not feeding that root exudates into the soil. So it's a tool that can be used really well. It's just understanding how to use it in your system and kind of earning that right a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if a farmer's starting somewhat from scratch, even though we've got relatively decent diversity here, how would they go about choosing the species, or is there kind of a framework that you guys have developed?
We've got a framework that goes with that booklet that I'm talking about, and again, it's not it's not necessarily novel because we've built on lots and lots of other research that others have done. But sort of two things to start with, Conan. I think one is to be clear on the objectives of the farmer, and define those as clearly and specifically as they can. So not I want to improve persistence. That's not clear. That's an objective, but it's not clear. So what does that mean for you? Does it mean you want to have a certain level of ground cover at a certain time of year, or you want to have you want to reduce the amount of time that you're renovating your pastures? And so, being clear on what the objectives are, and then also to start identifying constraints. So that's where the location of your farm, the layout, the climate effects, those sorts of things, soil effects come in. And also the management, you might identify that you need to, work a little bit more on having a mentor to help you, or getting a consultant to help you. Spend a bit of time looking at what other people are doing in your region or in other parts of the country. So when you've got those two things together, that'll allow you a bit of a framework to say, okay, what is it I'm really trying to achieve, and what might be holding me back? And then the next bit down from that is to select what we're calling functional traits. And that's things like, rooting depth, ground cover, those sorts of things. And all the research says, and in fact all the farmer experience that I'm aware of says, that a strategic selection of plants is far better than just a number of plants. Mm-hmm. So being able to strategically say, okay, I want things that have got a greater rooting depth because I'm really trying to overcome a summer feed gap. What does persistence mean? Everything dies out after a dry summer, or 30% of my farm periodically goes underwater at different times of the year, and then, very little comes back from that. Okay, cool. So now you've got, what time of year is it? What's the stress that's being imposed? Then the functional trait you're looking for is something that's more water tolerant, tolerant to waterlogging. So you're talking tall fescue, you're talking timothy, you're talking strawberry clover, those sorts of things, bird's foot trefoil, rather than, just putting ryegrass back in. Then the next step on our list is to check the compatibility, because not all these things play well together. And some species have got, what we call an allelopathic effect. So they'll basically poison plants through basically through chemicals, or because of their growth pattern. Most things that grow straight upright, like most of our grasses, apart from kikuyu and brown top, compete really strongly for light. And you've got to not let them grow too tall if you want to maintain legumes in there, because clovers hate shading. So, that's sort of, you've identified what you're trying to get, you've identified the constraints, you've said, okay, that brings me down to the functionality I'm after, summer activity, deep rooting, etc. And then you check the compatibility. And when you do that, you might end up with a dozen things that fit. And then you go, cool, do I put all dozen in? Or I'd be encouraging people to think about selecting 1 to 2 from grass, legume and herb out of that list, and then putting those in as a start. Or even more pragmatically, adding what you don't have out of that list to what you've already got. Mm. So you're not talking about major renovation across the whole farm and a big cost in seed and a big cost in getting it in. You're talking about, and you might have, 12 things. How do you pick your 4? You might have 3 lots of 4 that go in different paddocks side by side in the next couple of years. And then you go, shit, these are the ones I'm going with because they're the ones I like the best, or they best fit my system.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to learn just from the observation around the farm as well in terms of narrowing that 12 down to perhaps 4, because we have a lot of these pasture species volunteering through other pastures all over a farm. And you might say, we had some lucerne seed came in with a flood one year and it's really taken on those paddocks there. Or no matter what I do, I've got wild plantain coming up in this one. So some of that localized knowledge can again feed into that. And I guess the other key takeaway is to really start with what you have or what you know, because you still need to be farming and managing these pastures from day dot. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to start from things that you know are successful for you as a farmer.
And then acknowledging that with your system, diversity reduces with a higher stocking rate generally, and diversity reduces with sheep compared to cattle, because sheep are more selective grazers. So you're always going to have, all other things being equal, if you're running a higher stocking rate of sheep on your farm, because that's what your system is, then what you see as diversity might be different to what your neighbour sees as diversity who's running cattle with a lower stocking rate or a similar stocking rate, because they graze differently.
I guess that is the one point is you've gone through all this process, you've decided that, you've made the observation. How does grazing management have to then adapt to that? What tips do you have for farmers on that front?
Anything with a higher crown, so the crown is where the active growing part of the plant is, and for a lot of our pasture species it's right down at ground level. So ryegrass and white clover, it's right down. Clover, it's the end of those stolons, the end of those runners, and ryegrass, it's right down in the base of the plant unless the plant's shaded, and then it comes off the ground chasing light. Other species have naturally got a higher crown. They'll sit a little bit above the ground. So lucerne's an example of that. Chicory and plantain are an example of that. Red clover is another example. Cocksfoot has got a slightly higher crown. And so they all benefit from a slightly longer residual. So instead of targeting that sort of magical 15 to 1700 for the dairy industry, it might be 17 to 1900 that you target, because we've found no benefit in leaving a residual of 2 to 2,500, for example. So, no benefit in leaving almost twice as much behind in terms of plant survival, plant density. You still want to be utilising what you've got and grazing it down. That would be one thing. And then I guess that we're still playing around a little bit with rotation, but ryegrass is a 3-leaf plant, and there's not 3 live leaves per tiller. There's not too many times when you'd want to come in later than that, unless you're building a feed reserve through deferred grazing. In winter, for example, is a good systems level reason to come in later than that. Cocksfoot's got 5 leaves, so you can play around, and bromes have, like prairie grass, pasture brome, have between 5 and 6 leaves. So fescue's got 4. So as you add in some of these other grasses, there's opportunities to play around a bit with the rotation, with a slightly longer rotation, and you've still got live green material there that's going to give you good milk production, good lamb growth, good young stock growth, if that's what you're aiming for, without compromising the quality of the pasture.
So there is an element of compromising between the plants to find, like obviously you're going to go past the 3-leaf stage with the ryegrass when you do have that diversity in it. You have to compromise a little bit on what's optimal for all of the plants in that grazing management, though, don't you?
Yeah, that's right, because if you're looking at why you want to add something else in, and a lot of farmers will say, well, I'll put a bit of cocksfoot in because the ryegrass. So what we've found in our dairy farmlets is we've got 5 species that are dominating, or that have dominated. It's ryegrass and white clover, cocksfoot and red clover, and plantain. And not surprisingly, they're 5 of the more what we call plastic species, so the ones that can adapt to a whole range of managements. And they're the ones that are showing up the most undercutting as well. We've got a study, undercutting, where we're trying to work out, as a lot of the research does, when you've got multiple treatments you're trying to apply at once, and you're looking at different rotations, different residuals. And again, those 5 are the 5 that are among the most abundant under cutting heights that range from 2 to 8 centimetres, and rotations that range from sort of 2 to 8 weeks. So they're your 5, and then what we're finding is that, and others are showing up. So we've still got chicory showing up. In some paddocks, it's quite dominant. We've got brome shows up in some paddocks. It's quite dominant. We've got fescue. We've got lucerne, but those are the 5 that are doing the heavy lifting across most of the area. What we find in summer is that it's cocksfoot and red clover and plantain dominant, and we're not seeing much ryegrass and white clover, but they're still there. And then as the months cool down, we're getting ryegrass, white clover dominance through the winter and spring months. And so you'll sort of see, but the cocksfoot hasn't died, it's still there, it's just not as prominent. So what we're grazing for in those months should be probably based on more of ryegrass type management, acknowledging that the harder we take those pastures down, or the closer the residuals are, the more we might be jeopardising red clover in there as something with a higher crown. Whereas when we get into summer, when the ryegrass is going sort of semi-dormant because of the lack of moisture and warmer temperatures, why would you still have a ryegrass management system at that time of year when it's not the most dominant species? So you can think through your way, that it's not as if, it is thing about before about what a lot of farmers would like is, 5 things at 20% equal abundance. You don't get that. And so you get, 1 or 2 things or 3 things dominating, and you go, cool, now I'm managing for those several things. What is it I need to remember to not kill off the other couple of things that are still in the background? Or you might have 8 other things in the background, but 2 that are in abundance. I'm not counting the 1 chicory plant that we saw in the gateway as diversity because it would look great.
That
we
one
love
Phalaris on the lane.
But yeah, that's right. The good old Australian Phalaris grass that I wanted in the mix that everyone gives me shit for because it's only really showing up on the fence lines and laneways. It's getting bullied out by these bloody European grasses.
So I guess those are the kind of would you say almost the workhorses in a lot of pasture species, those 5?
I think they're among some of the more adaptable. And as you go into drier environments, you'd replace your grasses with lucerne or something that's got a true taproot and is another good perennial. Those 5 are among the most adaptable. And ryegrass has got, not only is it a good grass, which is why it's been chosen, but it's had the benefit of 100 and something years worth of breeding efforts on it. Whereas some of these other species, and I don't subscribe to the silver bullet theory of this, let's chase something different every year. But I will give the seed companies a lot of credit for what they've done in recent times with cocksfoot and tall fescue. And the plants that we're growing now, that are out on the market now, are different from what your parents and grandparents grew. Similar, we talk about lucerne, and I talk to farmers, and some of the guys in their 60s and 70s and 80s are like, oh, no, that doesn't stand up under grazing. Well, you're right, it didn't. The older types of lucerne, the older types of red clover, they were a one-hit wonder. They were for cutting only. And as soon as you grazed them, that was the end of them. Mm. But then we've selected species, or the seed companies have, and the breeders have, selected species and bred lines that are more persistent under grazing. Chicory and plantain were weeds only a few decades ago because they're very palatable, just like dandelion and a few others are, but they hug the ground. And so the animals have got to be half starving before they access them. Or you've got to have lots of density around them to push their leaves up where the animals can eat them. And then they've been taught to stand up, and lo and behold, everyone wants them in the pasture, and we love them. So, it's only a matter of time before, there's breeding programs in Europe, in parts of Europe now on dandelion. There's work underway to look at selecting lines of dock that are more palatable. Mm-hmm. So there's things that are coming in the pipeline. But right now we've got to deal with what we've got, which is the sort of 20 to 30 species that are commercially available in the country.
That's very interesting. I like the thing about docks because I will see cows that sometimes selectively eat those over like a ryegrass at different times a year within a pasture. I guess they're just, at that time of year, they're accumulating from the soil, something in the soil that makes them more palatable, potentially. Yeah, but then once they get a bit stemmy, they won't do that. They have to be like, I think, you're done.
Most species, when they're green and leafy, there's very little in the quality of them, apart from some mineral content. And probably polyphenols, or chemical compounds, of which the average plant's got a couple of thousand, and we know what about 24 are, and the rest are just who knows. So there's huge area to explore in there. Docks, as they start to go to seed, do what a number of other species do. They start accumulating what we call anti-quality factors. Mm-hmm. Some of those are tannins, some of those are nitrates. Grasses do it with endophyte alkaloids. And so, all of those things have got a bitter taste to us, and we presume to animals as well, which is why the palatability drops off. But inherently there's nothing wrong with a dock. When you collect it and get it chemical analysed, it's got, sort of moderate to low earth fibre levels. It's got high mineral levels like anything with a taproot has, and it has at different times of the year high sugar levels. So, it's just that it also accumulates these anti-quality factors, and it does want to spread sideways where animals have actually got to work to get it to perk up and eat.
I guess one question around quality is that people seem to think that you lose quality when you push out your grass too far or the rotation too long with ryegrass, but I inherently see that people don't even hit the third leaf, and they're still worried about that. Is from your experience, when you do have that diversity in there and you're going past that third leaf, so you're making a little bit of compromise, is that evened out by the diversity within the sward?
Really good question, Conan. I think we saw that in the first year. We had on Valentine's Day, second year actually, when we had the floods, and the Titatia stream backed up and ran backwards through our dairy farm, and 2/3 of the farm went underwater and everything was sort of silted off. So we were waiting for the next rainfall to wash the silt off the leaves before we could put the cows in. We had a number of those paddocks locked up for silage. In fact, they were due to be cut the day after. So that was a sort of a rotation that was long enough for people to fall over in the pasture. It was waist high on me, and I'm sort of 5'11" and a bit. So it's a good metre tall. We had so many herbs and legumes in there, particularly some of the climbing legumes like vetch and those sorts of things, that the quality of that was still quite high. Yes, we had dead material, yes, we had stem, but it wasn't grass dominant. Now, I would expect, as it naturally has become more grass dominant, if I put cows or sheep into something that was waist high, that I would have a lower quality in that pasture. So it is a bit situation dependent, and certainly when we had high diversity at the start with a number of our annual legumes, which is part of our strategy to sort of back off nitrogen fertiliser and put a lot of nitrogen in naturally through the legumes, that the quality was maintained really high, wasn't it, Edu, around those pastures, even when they were very long?
Yeah, absolutely. And even in our standard ryegrass clover pastures as well, where over summer we're intentionally sort of closing the door temporarily on the ryegrass and focusing on growing red clover. It's absolute rocket fuel that the cows are going into there. So I think, yeah, it's about those trade-offs, and that, yes, your ryegrass is going to start losing quality on some of those longer rounds and taller pastures, but that might not be what you're looking for at that time anyway.
And Conan, the research on it that I myself and others have done with ryegrass says that the plants will become, as they become more mature, they become more fibrous, and you get a drop off in metabolizable energy. But on average, it's about 0.2 megajoules that you lose between growing right out to the 3-leaf stage, and that's biologically insignificant. You won't pick up a milk production difference in that. That the plant grows, the pasture grows about half its yield between the 2 and the 3-leaf stage because of the sigmoid curve in growth. Leaves are bigger than the ones before them, and that pseudostem that pushes each leaf apart. So faster rotations will give you what looks like a better quality pasture, but it's not actually significant. Unless the pasture is going to seed, that's the only proviso where, it might actually be at peak quality at the 2-leaf stage or 2.5-leaf stage, and letting it go that extra 5 or 6 or 7 days to get that fully to the 3-leaf stage, you might end up with another 15% seed head in there, which does reduce the quality. But most, pretty much throughout the year, it's about a 0.2 megajoule drop, which is nothing.
Yeah, I think the only time we've managed to sort of generate really poor quality feed as we measure it would be deferred grazing quite late deferred grazing of perennial ryegrass. I think that wasn't such a winner. Whereas deferred grazing on some of the taller growing species in the diverse pastures, we've maintained pretty good feed quality even after 10 to 12 week close up there.
Oh, that's good to know. So you guys are doing some pretty interesting research at the moment. What's like one topic that you would like to do, or an area you'd like to express, or from, I guess, yourself? Is it around Euro, or is it...
Let Danny go first so I have time to think.
Oh, yeah, look, just in general, I think we're only scratching the surface with what the compounds that plants have got in them and what impact that might have on the microbiome of the soil and on the microbiome of the animal, and what some of those compounds do. And also, I think the plant and soil interactions are a fascinating area, Conan, that a lot of people make claims on. A lot of those claims in the plant world, when you read the research, are around a 400-year-old oak tree and the root and the rhizosphere of that, and that's not directly transferable to pasture. Pasture plants aren't small trees, or it's done on a community of aspen or birch or something like that, which is fascinating, but there hasn't been the same sort of work done in pastures. And we're seeing enough differences between how pasture plants work and how trees work in forest communities to know that we're not just going to be able to directly translate those results. And I think being able to get farmers comfortable with diversity, and for some farmers it might be adding one more legume to their ryegrass white clover, and other farmers it might be saying, well, bugger it, I know you told me not to go beyond about 5 or 6, but I'm going to put 10 because I like 10. 10's a nice round number. At the end of the day, it's up to the farmer, right? And we're only just talking about what the science tells. And being comfortable with that. What's the management that comes with that? Not to a stage where you've got every paddock on the farm's got something different in it. It's amazing, but it's burning the farmer out in terms of the headspace they've got to be in to try and manage all that and bring it together. So, that's why we're erring on the side of pragmatism and trying to say, well, okay, here's what the research says. What is it a farmer could practically do that would be doable for, pretty much any farmer in the country if they wanted to take it on? That's where I think we're heading. So getting the message out, being able to, as a scientist, to close some of those loops, because each little study we do is like a piece in a billion-piece jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to put together, and you've got your little piece here that you're trying to work out where it fits and which part of the story it tells. So yeah, it's fascinating.
So I've had time to think now. So I think for me it's really around the decision support on the diverse pastures, because I think one of the sort of productive beauties of a ryegrass white clover system is you can teach people to manage that pretty effectively without too much trouble. And certainly from what we've seen, we can grow more pastures at very high quality from a diverse pasture, but there's still this gulf of uncertainty of how do we utilise that most effectively, because we don't manage to capture as much production in the vat or on the hook from those pastures despite growing more. And so that uncertainty of why there, I think, is what really excites me. And what would best management look like in a highly dynamic, evolving, diverse pasture, which is going to be a lot harder than it would be for a more... ryegrass pastures aren't static, but a more static framed system.
No, I think that'd be fascinating. A lot of the work you guys have already done is probably helping to demystify a lot of that and make it more practical and understandable for farmers. I know that article you wrote in the NZIPM Rural Professionals magazine, that's probably one of the best and most simplest ones for someone to actually understand the processes and the reasons why you would choose certain things and what you're trying to achieve. And it kept coming back to the practicalities about what the farmer wants and the functionality, which I think is probably one of the key takeaways of today, is thinking about that functionality, not just the number of species.
Yeah. Because, for us, plants are cool. More species is awesome, but I think, for most people out there farming and trying to eke out a living from that, I think it really comes back to the function that they're going to get from it, because that's their ROI, really.
Yeah, and then the plants become cool for them once they get that function.
It's a gateway drug.
Yeah, spot on. So, and we've got to keep reminding ourselves of that as researchers, that why we're doing this, and the farmer's got to be at the centre of it. Otherwise, there's some really cool stuff to chase down. And I wish I had another 15 lifetimes to do it in. But, at the end of the day, so what? What's it going to lead to? Who's it going to benefit? And how does it help someone who's trying to manage a difficult situation, or a difficult climate, or juggling multiple issues at the same time.
100%. So I like to finish up my podcast with a quickfire question for all of my guests, and the question is: what's one belief or principle that keeps you grounded, no matter what season you're in life?
Oh, I actually have a mantra.
Nice.
I could be wrong. I think it's really important to keep front of mind. It's not about putting yourself down, but you just go into a situation, whether it's an interaction with another person, or looking at a piece of data, or your idea of how things are going to pan out in your future. You just think, I could be wrong, and temper your expectation with that. And I think that can guide you through a lot of interactions and challenges really well. To just have that humility of knowing that you don't know.
In my translation, it'd probably be I'm often wrong. For me, I think that for me, Conan, comes back to why I'm interested in science in the first place. And science is just about asking questions. People make too much of it, particularly at school level, and tell kids that science is hard and, you've got to be smart to do it. I'm living proof that you don't have to be smart to do science. But it's about asking questions, which then gets you focused on, am I asking the right question? Which comes back to Eru's point around, all the things that I've learned in my 30-year career, I'm still challenging myself all the time around not throw the baby out with the bathwater, start over again, etc. But, trying to make sure that I'm not stuck in a rut of my own, belief system, and, this has worked, so it's always going to work, and it has to work. And that's where you see people come unstuck, isn't it? So I love answering questions for farmers, which means I love sort of exploring what the question is.
That's a very good one. My partner always hammers home for me that to ask better questions, because then you get better answers.
Yeah.
So just being aware that if you want some good answers, you got to come up with. Then you put more pressure on yourself to come up with better questions.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So if the listeners want to connect with either of you on the work you're doing, what's the best place to go and learn?
We have a website.
They should Google Whenua Haumanu, and we've got a page on the Massey website there that has regular fortnightly updates with how our farmlets are running. They can sign up for a monthly newsletter. It has profiles of us, the work we're doing, our students, and the results we're pushing out as well.
So that's WHENUA HAUMANU, isn't it? If I managed to spell that out for myself.
Yeah. I'll put a link in below into the description for the podcast, so make it easy.
Everybody knows how to spell.
Yeah.
No, come on.
It's a test.
Australian
you have to earn
so.
this knowledge.
Yeah. I would have started with an F. F-E-N.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, guys. It's been a great conversation. I felt like I probably spent another 3 hours asking you questions related to pasture and grazing management. But thank you for sharing your knowledge today. It's been great. I'm sure it was provided a lot more clarity for the listeners.
Cool. Thank you, Conan. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. It was a lot of fun.